My name is Clara, 32 years old, and I just watched my family serve my 7-year-old son a basket of free bread while his cousins ate $200 steaks. We were sitting in one of the most exclusive steakhouses in Chicago, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and wealthy patrons. My sister leaned across the table, her diamond earrings catching the light, and smirked. "We did not order for your son. We figured you could not afford the split bill." My father chuckled and added that I should have packed him a lunch. I looked at my son, then looked back at them and simply smiled. "Noted," I said. They had no idea that within the hour I would freeze every single credit account, tying their fake empire together. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who thought they could walk all over you. Growing up in our family meant living under a microscope where your worth was determined entirely by your bank account and your social standing. My parents, Richard and Patricia, built a commercial real estate business that funded a life of luxury and endless appearances. My older sister, Brittany, absorbed their values perfectly. She married a corporate lawyer named Jamal and dedicated her life to curating a flawless image on social media. They played the part of Chicago elite beautifully, wearing the right designer brands, dining at the right restaurants, and making sure everyone knew just how important they were. I was the exact opposite. I never cared about the country club memberships or the designer handbags. And because I refused to play their superficial games, I was labeled the family disappointment. That toxic dynamic was never more obvious than tonight. My mother had insisted on this dinner at a high-end Wagyu steakhouse downtown. It was a place where reservations had to be made months in advance, and the menu prices were enough to make an average person gasp. I agreed to come because I wanted my son Leo to have some relationship with his grandparents and his cousins. I always tried to keep the peace for his sake. We were seated at a massive round table in a private alcove. The room smelled of rich roasted meats and expensive wine. Leo sat quietly beside me, coloring on a piece of paper I had brought from home, being on his absolute best behavior. He was wearing his favorite button-down shirt, excited for what my mother had called a fancy family feast. The adults ordered expensive cocktails and laughed loudly, ignoring us completely. When the food finally arrived, the servers carried out massive wooden boards covered in smoking, dry-aged tomahawk steaks. The meat was sizzling, perfectly cooked and garnished with roasted garlic and truffle butter. The servers carefully placed these magnificent plates in front of Brittany, Jamal, my parents, and even Brittany's 3 young children. The kids immediately started tearing into the expensive meat, complaining loudly about the side dishes. Then a waiter approached Leo. Instead of setting down a plate of hot food, he placed a small wicker basket filled with complimentary dinner rolls in front of my 7-year-old boy. I stared at the plain bread, then looked up at the waiter, assuming there had been a terrible mistake. But the waiter just gave me a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile and quickly walked away to fetch more wine for my father. I turned my gaze to my sister. Brittany was casually cutting into her huge steak, taking a slow sip of her red wine before meeting my eyes. Her expression was dripping with condescension. "We did not order for your son," she said loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "The steaks here are $200 each. Knowing your financial situation, we figured you could not afford the split bill if we added him to the tab. So we asked them to bring extra bread." She smiled sweetly as if she had just done me a massive favor. Jamal chuckled next to her, adjusting his expensive watch. "It is just basic math, Clara," he added smoothly. "You have to live within your means." Before I could even formulate a response to that sheer cruelty, my father Richard chimed in from the head of the table. He did not even look up from his plate as he spoke. "Jamal is right. You should have packed the boy a lunch if you wanted him to eat. You know how these dinners work. Nobody is handing out charity here. You are an adult. You need to provide for your own child instead of expecting us to foot the bill." My mother Patricia just sat there delicately dabbing her mouth with a cloth napkin, choosing silence over defending her own grandson. I looked down at Leo. I was staring at the basket of bread, his little hands resting on his lap. He did not cry or complain, but the quiet confusion in his eyes shattered my heart. In that terrible moment, the past rushed back to me. I remembered standing on the porch of my parents' suburban mansion 7 years ago. I was 25 years old, holding a newborn Leo in my arms, begging them for a place to stay after my relationship fell apart. They had locked the door in my face, telling me that a single mother was an embarrassment to the family name. They threw me out into the cold, expecting me to fail, expecting me to come crawling back and begging for forgiveness. They assumed I was still struggling to make ends meet, working some dead-end job just to keep the lights on. I took a deep breath, pushing the painful memories away, and brought myself back to the opulent steakhouse. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just smiled. My mother, Patricia, sighed loudly, placing her heavy silver fork down on the pristine white tablecloth with a dramatic clatter. She looked at me with that highly familiar expression of exhausted disappointment she had perfected over 3 decades. "Clara, please do not start with the dramatic victim routine tonight," she admonished, leaning forward so the diamond necklace resting on her collarbone caught the ambient restaurant lighting. "You always ruin these expensive family gatherings by being overly sensitive about every little thing. Nobody is trying to insult you or the boy. We are simply being practical. You know exactly how tight things must be for you right now living in that tiny apartment. It is just a steak, for heaven's sake. Do not make a mountain out of a molehill." Her words were smooth and deliberately practiced, designed entirely to make me look like the unreasonable one, while completely validating their collective cruelty. It was classic gaslighting. She wanted me to feel incredibly grateful they had even allowed me to occupy a chair at their high-end table. I reached over and gently rubbed Leo's small shoulder. He was quietly nibbling on a dinner roll, completely oblivious to the venom dripping from his grandmother's carefully painted lips. Jamal leaned back heavily in his plush leather booth, crossing his arms and letting his tailored suit jacket pull back just enough to expose the massive gold luxury watch shining on his left wrist. He was a corporate lawyer, 36 years old, a highly ambitious African-American man who absolutely loved to remind everyone in the room about his exorbitant billable hours and his aggressive courtroom victories. I thrived on the wealthy facade. My family constantly projected and fit perfectly into my sister Brittany's superficial world of designer labels and luxury vacations. "Look," Clara, Jamal said, using his deep authoritative courtroom voice to command the attention of the entire table. "If it is really that big of a deal to you, I can throw a side of French fries onto my corporate tab. I will even get him a small bowl of macaroni and cheese if the kitchen makes it. It is absolutely no skin off my back. Consider it a small favor from your successful brother-in-law." The dripping pity in his tone was suffocating. He looked at me the exact way someone might look at a stray dog begging for greasy scraps outside a busy restaurant window. He wanted to play the generous, wealthy savior while simultaneously rubbing his supposed corporate wealth right in my face. He fully expected me to bow my head and thank him profusely for throwing cheap carbohydrate crumbs at my young child, while his own kids feasted on premium cuts of imported beef. "No thank you, Jamal," I replied, my voice remaining completely steady and completely cold as ice. "Leo and I are perfectly fine. We absolutely do not need your fries or your condescending favors." Brittany rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might actually get stuck in the back of her head. "Suit yourself," she muttered loudly, slicing a massive piece of perfectly seared Wagyu beef and shoving it ungracefully into her mouth. "Do not come crying to us or blame us when he goes home hungry tonight. Just remember, we generously offered to help you out." With my firm refusal issued, the entire table instantly forgot about my son and me. It was exactly as if a physical switch had been flipped, and we completely ceased to exist in their self-absorbed universe. The conversation immediately shifted rapidly back to the only topic my family truly cared about: themselves, their status, and their money. Richard took a long, arrogant sip of his expensive aged bourbon and began loudly boasting about his commercial real estate company to anyone within earshot. He spoke grandly and arrogantly about upcoming corporate acquisitions, towering downtown high-rises, and a massive urban revitalization project he confidently claimed would double his personal net worth by the end of the fiscal quarter. He told Jamal and Brittany all about a massive influx of external capital he was supposedly expecting, a major corporate bailout from a highly secretive and high-profile private equity firm that would cement his legacy in the competitive Chicago real estate market forever. Jamal nodded eagerly, like an obedient subordinate chewing his expensive steak and chiming in frequently to brag loudly about his own recent legal maneuvering. He talked loudly over my mother to explain the intricate complexities of the massive corporate mergers he was currently orchestrating, dropping complicated legal jargon specifically designed to make him sound absolutely indispensable to his firm. He bragged endlessly about the massive retainer fees his law firm charged their wealthy clients and how he was actively planning to buy Brittany a brand new luxury sports utility vehicle for their upcoming wedding anniversary. Patricia clapped her manicured hands together in pure delight, loudly praising Jamal for being such a wonderful, generous provider and looking pointedly at me to ensure I fully registered the insulting comparison between her successful son-in-law and my single mother status. They spent the next hour building a towering, fragile house of cards right there at the dinner table. They shamelessly fed each other's massive egos, inflating their supposed business success and their imaginary bank accounts with every single boastful sentence they uttered into the ambient restaurant air. They completely and utterly ignored the sweet 7-year-old boy sitting quietly and politely eating plain bread right next to them. I sat silently observing their pathetic performance, knowing exactly how incredibly fragile their fake financial empire truly was. I watched them celebrate imaginary money they did not actually have using corporate credit lines that were practically bursting at the seams to maintain a lifestyle built entirely on smoke and mirrors. They thought they held all the power tonight, completely unaware that I held the match that would burn their pathetic little illusions down to the ground. The dinner service finally began to wind down after what felt like an absolute eternity of endless bragging and insufferable posturing. The waiters cleared away the massive empty wooden boards that had previously held the expensive dry-aged steak plates. Brittany leaned back in her plush chair, patting her stomach and complaining loudly about how incredibly full she was, entirely ignoring the fact that my son Leo was still sitting quietly beside me with an empty stomach. Patricia pulled a compact mirror from her designer handbag to check her lipstick, signaling that this miserable family gathering was finally nearing its highly anticipated conclusion. Jamal raised his hand high in the air, snapping his fingers aggressively at a passing waiter. "Check," he barked out using that same authoritative courtroom voice he had been practicing all evening. When the waiter approached our table carrying a sleek black leather folio, Jamal did not even bother to look at the itemized receipt. He simply reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy metal corporate credit card, tossing it onto the table with a loud, obnoxious clack. "Make it quick," he instructed the waiter dismissively. "I need to expense this entire $4,000 dinner to the firm before the accounting department closes their monthly billing cycle tomorrow morning." He looked over at Richard and winked conspiratorially. "Client entertainment," he announced with a sleazy grin. "It is the absolute best perk of being the lead legal counsel for a major commercial real estate firm. The company covers the tab, and we get to enjoy the absolute finest cuts of meat this city has to offer." Richard laughed loudly, clapping Jamal on the back in a rare display of paternal affection that he had certainly never shown to me. "That is exactly how wealthy men operate," Richard declared proudly. "You use the corporate accounts to fund the lifestyle. Why use personal money when the business can write it off as an operational expense?" Brittany beamed with pride, reaching over to squeeze his arm. "You are so smart, babe," she purred. She then turned her gaze toward me, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. "You see, Clara, this is what real financial success actually looks like. You build a solid career, you secure a powerful position, and you let the corporate perks pay for the luxury. Maybe if you had not thrown your entire life away, you would not be sitting there calculating how to afford a basic meal. You could have been experiencing dinners like this every single week." I did not respond to her petty provocations. Instead, I calmly raised my right hand, catching the attention of the general manager, who had been observing our loud table from across the dining room. The manager, a sharply dressed man named Thomas, who prided himself on maintaining the exclusive atmosphere of the restaurant, immediately recognized my signal and walked briskly toward our alcove. "Yes, madam?" Thomas asked politely, completely bypassing Jamal and Richard to address me directly. Is there something else I can assist you with this evening? Jamal scoffed loudly, clearly deeply offended that the general manager had completely ignored his heavy corporate card sitting on the table. She does not need anything, Jamal interrupted aggressively. Just run the card so we can get out of here. Thomas did not even glance in his direction. He kept his professional focus entirely locked on me, waiting patiently for my instructions. I reached into my small leather clutch and retrieved a solid titanium black American Express Centurion card, placing it gently onto the pristine white tablecloth. The Centurion card is not something you can simply apply for. It is an exclusive invitation-only status symbol reserved exclusively for individuals with massive net worths and extraordinarily high annual spending. The moment the distinctive black titanium hit the table, the entire atmosphere around us shifted instantaneously. Thomas looked down at the card, then looked back up at my face. His professional demeanor instantly transformed into an expression of absolute deference and deep respect. He recognized the card, and more importantly, he recognized the incredibly powerful financial status it represented in the wealthy corporate world of Chicago. Miss Clara, Thomas said, his voice lowering to a tone of profound respect. It is an absolute honor to have you dining with us tonight. I was not aware you were joining us this evening. Please accept my most sincere apologies for not greeting you personally the moment you walked through our doors. Had I known you were present, I would have ensured you received our premium VIP service immediately. The sudden shift in his behavior was completely lost on my family for a split second until the heavy realization finally hit them. Jamal stared at the solid titanium black card sitting on the table, his eyes widening in total shock. He was a corporate lawyer who dealt with wealthy clients daily. He knew exactly what an American Express Centurion card was, and he knew exactly how much raw financial power was required to possess one. Richard stopped laughing mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared at the small piece of black metal. Brittany looked incredibly confused, glancing back and forth between his panicked face and my perfectly calm expression. Patricia just sat completely frozen, her compact mirror forgotten in her hand. Thomas, I said smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely ignoring the stunned silence emanating from my biological family. I need to place a special order to go. I would like your finest cut of imported A5 Wagyu ribeye, perfectly seared medium rare. Please add a generous side of your signature truffle mashed potatoes, the grilled asparagus, and a slice of your double chocolate mousse cake. Please pack it all up nicely. This meal is specifically for my son Leo. He has been incredibly patient tonight, and he deserves a proper dinner. Thomas bowed his head immediately, carefully picking up my black card with utmost respect. Before you process the charge for my son's meal, Thomas, I have one more request. Calculate the total bill for every single table currently dining in this restaurant tonight. Every appetizer, expensive bottle of wine, dry-aged steak, and dessert. I want to pay for all of it. Put every tab in the restaurant on my black card. Thomas paused, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. Paying for an entire high-end steakhouse would easily run into the tens of thousands of dollars. He looked at me, confirming I was serious. It would be my pleasure to handle that, Miss Clara, he replied smoothly. However, I continued, there is one specific exception. I pointed directly at the center of our large round table. This table right here, my biological family. They are not included in my gesture of goodwill tonight. They will be paying their own bill. Every single cent of their $4,000 tab remains their responsibility. Do not put their expenses on my card. The humiliation that washed over my family was a beautiful sight. The blood rushed out of my mother's face so fast she looked ill. Patricia gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, staring at me in total disbelief. She had spent the evening parading her supposed wealth, only to be publicly excluded from a display of real financial power by the daughter she had spent decades degrading. Brittany looked like she had just been slapped across the face. Her jaw dropped open, and she stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. She looked frantically at her husband, waiting for him to fix her shattered reality. Jamal, enraged by the sudden shift in power, let out a loud scoff. He refused to look at my titanium card, clinging to his fragile ego. We do not need your charity, Clara, Jamal spat. I am expensing this entire dinner to the corporate account. My firm handles massive acquisitions daily. We do not need a pathetic handout from someone trying way too hard to prove something. He snatched his corporate card from the table and shoved it into the chest of the waiting server. "Run it," Jamal commanded fiercely. "Run the card right now and bring me the receipt. We are leaving." The waiter nodded nervously, taking Jamal's corporate card and retreating toward the main payment terminal. Thomas respectfully took my black card and followed him to process my request. Silence descended upon our alcove. It was the suffocating silence of people who just realized they were no longer the most powerful individuals in the room. Richard glared at me with fury, his hands balled into tight fists. He hated losing control. "You think you are being clever," Richard hissed across the table, his voice threatening. "I do not know whose credit card you stole or what kind of massive debt you put yourself into to pull this little stunt tonight, but you are still a disappointment to this family. You always have been, and you always will be. Money does not change the fact you are a failure." I smiled at him, feeling zero emotion toward the man who abandoned me. "You can think whatever helps you sleep at night, Richard," I replied calmly. A few minutes later, the waiter returned to our table. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight nervously. He bypassed me entirely and walked straight over to Jamal. He held the corporate card between two fingers, looking down at the table rather than making eye contact. "I am terribly sorry, sir," the waiter murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "I tried running the card 3 times, but the transaction will not go through." "What are you talking about?" Jamal demanded, snatching the card out of the waiter's hand. "Run it again. The machine must be broken. It is a premium corporate account with an unlimited balance." The waiter swallowed hard, taking a small step back. "The machine is working perfectly, sir. The system is displaying a specific error code. Your card has been frozen by the issuing bank. The account is completely locked." The declaration hit the table like a physical bomb. Jamal stared at the waiter, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple. "That is impossible," he shouted, slamming his fist down on the table. "My firm has millions in that account. Call the bank right now." Richard suddenly looked panicked, reaching into his wallet to pull out another corporate card linked to the same holding company. "Here, use mine," Richard ordered urgently. "There must be a fraud alert on Jamal's card." I leaned back in my chair, smoothing my dress, and let out a cold laugh that cut through their rising panic. I placed my hand on Leo's shoulder, preparing him to stand up. "Do not bother running his card," I instructed the waiter. "It will give you the same error message." Jamal whipped his head around to glare at me, his eyes bulging with rage. "What did you just say?" I looked directly into Jamal's eyes, then shifted my gaze to Richard, savoring their destruction. I said, maintaining a chillingly calm tone. "I called the main investment bank and locked the primary credit lines for your entire holding company exactly 20 minutes ago. Every single corporate account, every credit card, every liquid asset tied to your commercial real estate firm is currently frozen solid." Richard gasped, clutching his chest. "You cannot do that," he choked out. "You are a nobody. You have absolutely no authority over my company finances." I stood up gracefully, helping Leo slide out of the booth. I took his small hand in mine, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute peace. "I am the senior partner at the private equity firm you have been begging for a bailout," I stated coldly. "I officially own your entire holding company now." I turned my back on my family and walked out. We left their fake empire in absolute ruins. The sun rose over the Chicago skyline, casting a brilliant golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse apartment. I stood in my kitchen, pouring a fresh cup of coffee and breathing in the quiet tranquility of the morning air. In the adjoining room, Leo was happily playing with his building blocks, completely unaffected by the absolute chaos that had transpired at the steakhouse the night before. He had eaten his dinner with a massive smile once we got home, and we had fallen asleep in total peace. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, feeling a sense of liberation wash over my entire body. For the first time in my 32 years of existence, I had not cowered away from my toxic family. I had stood my ground and fought back with power, but I knew the war was far from over. I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up my personal smartphone. It had been sitting face down on silent mode since the exact moment we walked out of that restaurant. When I tapped the sleek glass screen, the display immediately lit up with an overwhelming flood of angry red notifications. The family group chat, obnoxiously named the Elite Family Circle by my image-obsessed sister, was an absolute digital war zone. There were over 300 unread messages waiting for me. I leaned against the counter, took another long sip of my coffee, and began scrolling through the chaotic mess of digital rage. The messages were a perfect reflection of their fragile egos breaking under pressure. My brother Connor was the first to launch a massive attack. Connor was 29 years old, completely unemployed and currently living rent-free in the renovated basement of our parents' suburban mansion. Despite having absolutely no career or ambition, he carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a billionaire. He had typed out massive sprawling essays in the group chat, calling me an absolute disgrace to the family name. "You are totally psychotic, Clara," his first message read. "You come into a high-end restaurant, embarrass mom and dad in front of the management, and then spout some insane delusion about owning dad's company. You are literally insane. You need psychiatric help immediately. You have completely ruined everything. You are nothing but a massive failure trying to tear down successful people out of pure jealousy. Stay away from us." His aggressive tirade was immediately followed by a massive wall of text from my mother, Patricia. True to her highly manipulative nature, Patricia completely bypassed anger and went straight for the professional victim routine. Her messages were drenched in fake tears and heavy guilt trips. "Clara, I am physically shaking as I type this," she wrote. "My blood pressure is dangerously high, and your father had to take medication just to calm his heart rate down. How could you be so cruel to your own flesh and blood? We invited you to share a beautiful, expensive meal with us, and you repaid our incredible generosity with public humiliation. You traumatized your sister and completely disrespected Jamal. We have always given you everything, and this is how you treat us. I am sobbing in my bedroom right now. You need to apologize to everyone immediately before you destroy this family forever." I rolled my eyes at her pathetic attempt at gaslighting. She conveniently forgot the part where they refused to buy a 7-year-old boy a meal. I continued scrolling down the screen, bypassing dozens of dramatic crying emojis from Brittany until I reached the messages from Jamal. Jamal did not use emotional manipulation. He went straight for intimidation, using his status as a corporate lawyer to try and frighten me into submission. I was clearly panicking about the frozen credit cards and wanted to assert dominance. "Listen to me very carefully," Clara, Jamal typed, using excessively formal language to sound intimidating. "What you pulled last night was not just a pathetic prank, it was a severe legal violation. I am currently drafting a massive lawsuit against you for corporate interference, financial sabotage, and public defamation. You cannot just call the bank and impersonate an executive to freeze our holding company assets. That is federal wire fraud. I am contacting the authorities this morning. You are going to face federal prison time for this stunt. I suggest you call the bank right now, reverse whatever illegal lock you placed on my corporate accounts, and beg for our mercy. If you do not fix this immediately, I will personally ensure you are sued into complete bankruptcy. You messed with the wrong lawyer." I read his aggressive legal threats twice, letting out a soft laugh that echoed in the quiet kitchen. Jamal was blinded by arrogance, genuinely believing I committed fraud. He could not comprehend the terrifying reality that I held the legal authority to freeze those accounts. I felt no fear, only absolute control. I walked to my home office and booted up my corporate laptop. I did not type a defensive essay or apologize. Instead, I logged directly into the secure private equity firm database. I navigated the financial portfolios until I reached Richard's commercial real estate holding company file. I opened the main legal document finalized just 2 days prior. It was a formal document printed on the official letterhead of my private equity firm. The title was printed in bold, undeniable letters: Confidential Notice of Default and Asset Liquidation. The document clearly outlined that Richard's company had failed to meet financial obligations and our firm was officially seizing their commercial assets. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the page, ensuring every damning financial detail was perfectly legible. I picked up my smartphone, opened the chaotic family group chat, and attached the crisp screenshot. I did not add a single word. I simply just pressed send. I watched the read receipts pop up one by one. Then the chat went dead silent. The silence in the family group chat lasted for exactly 4 minutes. I stood in my quiet kitchen sipping my coffee and watching the digital clock on my oven tick forward. I knew exactly what was happening in their respective homes. Panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. They were staring at that confidential document, trying to comprehend how their fake reality had just collided with the harsh truth. Before the 5th minute could pass, my phone began to vibrate violently against the marble countertop. The caller ID flashed Jamal's name. He was not calling through the group chat, he was calling my personal cell phone directly. I set my coffee mug down, picked up the phone, and tapped the screen to accept the call. Before bringing the device to my ear, I swiftly pressed the record button on my secondary work phone, setting it right next to the speaker. I needed every single word of this conversation preserved. Clara. Jamal gasped into the receiver. His voice was completely unrecognizable. The deep, authoritative courtroom baritone he had practiced so meticulously the night before was entirely gone. He sounded breathless, frantic, and remarkably small. "What is this? What did you just send to the group chat?" I leaned against the kitchen island, feeling a cold smile form on my lips. "Good morning, Jamal," I replied smoothly. "I sent a confidential notice of default. I assumed a brilliant corporate lawyer like yourself would easily recognize standard asset liquidation paperwork." "Where did you get that?" Jamal demanded, his voice cracking slightly with rising hysteria. "Who gave that to you? You are a low-level clerk. You are a glorified secretary. There is absolutely no way you have the security clearance to access highly classified private equity documents. Did you hack into a corporate server? Did you steal this from an executive desk? Clara, you are crossing lines you do not even understand." I let him ramble, allowing his absolute terror to fill the silence. "Jamal," I said calmly, dropping the playful tone, "I did not steal anything. I am the senior partner managing the acquisition of Richard's failing company. I generated that document myself. I signed it. I authorized the asset freeze." "No," Jamal shouted, the sound echoing sharply through the speaker. "No, that is impossible. You do not have that kind of money. You do not have that kind of power. We are in the middle of securing a massive bailout. The investors promised us an extension." "There is no extension," I corrected him coldly. "The grace period expired at midnight. Your father-in-law defaulted on 3 massive commercial loans, and your holding company is completely insolvent." I could hear Jamal pacing rapidly on the other end of the line. His breathing was heavy and erratic. "You do not understand what you are doing," he pleaded, completely abandoning his arrogant lawyer persona. "Clara, you have to stop this liquidation process right now. You have to reverse the account freeze. If the private equity firm audits the holding company ledgers this week, we are completely destroyed." I raised an eyebrow, leaning closer to the recording device. "Destroyed how, Jamal?" I asked innocently. "A standard default is a civil matter. The firm simply seizes the commercial properties to cover the outstanding debt." "Why would a standard financial audit destroy you?" "Because the money is gone." Jamal blurted out, his panic overriding his legal training. "The corporate accounts are completely empty. We do not have the operational capital to cover the final payroll cycle this month." I narrowed my eyes. "What do you mean the money is gone? Where did the operational capital go?" Jamal let out a ragged, desperate breath. He was spiraling, trapped in a corner of his own making and looking for any possible way out. "Richard told me to move the funds," Jamal confessed frantically. "He told me to authorize the transfers. We had to keep up appearances, Clara. The investors needed to see a highly successful company. We had to maintain the image. Maintain the image with employee payroll funds." I pressed, ensuring my recording captured every single syllable clearly. "You took the money meant to pay the construction workers and the administrative staff. We needed the cash for Brittany." Jamal admitted, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to fund her lifestyle? The designer bags, the luxury leased vehicles, the constant European vacations for her social media pages. Brittany was throwing a massive fit about the yacht party. She demanded a luxury event to celebrate the upcoming bailout. She said she needed to show all her followers that we were richer than ever. The yacht rental, the catering, the premium champagne, it all cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We had no choice. We siphoned the employee payroll accounts to pay for Brittany's fake internet life. We thought the bailout money would arrive next week, and we could quietly replace the stolen funds before the quarterly audit. I stared at the recording device, almost unable to believe how easily he had just handed me the key to their absolute destruction. You siphoned employee payroll to fund a luxury yacht party, I repeated slowly, making sure the facts were stated with absolute clarity. You and Richard committed federal wire fraud and embezzlement, so my sister could post pictures on the internet. The harsh reality of my words seemed to finally pierce through his panic. Jamal suddenly went dead silent on the other end of the line. The realization of what he had just confessed out loud to me struck him like a physical blow. Clara, Jamal stammered, his voice trembling with a new kind of terror. Clara, listen to me. You cannot tell anyone about this. We are family. We can fix this quietly. Just unfreeze the accounts and let the bailout go through. I reached out and ended the recording on my secondary phone, safely securing the audio file to my encrypted cloud server. There is no bailout. Jamal, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. And we are not family. You made that perfectly clear when you let my son sit at your table with nothing but a basket of bread. I ended the call without waiting for his response. I placed my phone face down on the marble counter and took a deep, steadying breath. Jamal had just handed me the final weapon I needed. The financial default would take their properties, but the embezzlement confession would take their freedom. The trap was fully set, and they were already trapped inside it. I barely had a moment to process the absolute magnitude of Jamal confessing to federal wire fraud when the bright screen of my personal cell phone illuminated the marble countertop once again. The device vibrated violently against the smooth stone surface, rattling loudly in the quiet kitchen. I glanced down at the caller identification. It was Patricia. My mother was calling. I knew exactly what this meant. Jamal had undoubtedly rushed straight to my parents in a state of absolute terror, spinning whatever pathetic narrative he could invent to explain why their corporate credit lines were suddenly blocked. Now Patricia was being deployed as the emotional battering ram. She was the designated manipulator, the one who always knew exactly which psychological buttons to press to bring her children back into line. I picked up the phone, swiped the green icon, and pressed the cold glass against my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited in total silence for her to make the first move. Clara, my sweet girl. Patricia began, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that she specifically reserved for public appearances and heavy guilt trips. What on earth is happening over there? Your father is pacing the floor in absolute agony, and Jamal is hyperventilating in the home office. They are saying you sent some sort of fake legal document to the family chat. I know you are upset about last night, sweetheart, but this little prank of yours has gone entirely too far. You are causing your father severe chest pains. I listened to her smooth, practiced lies with absolute emotional detachment. She was actually trying to pretend that my notice of default was just a silly joke, completely ignoring the reality that their entire financial world was currently collapsing. It is not a prank, Patricia, I replied, my voice remaining perfectly calm and steady. The default is official. The holding company is completely insolvent. I suggest you tell Richard to start packing up his desk. Patricia let out a sharp, dramatic gasp. Clara, stop this nonsense right now, she scolded, her fake sweetness instantly dissolving into sharp maternal authority. I do not know what kind of game you are playing, but you are dealing with things you do not understand. We are your family. We are your blood. You do not treat your own flesh and blood this way over a trivial disagreement at a restaurant. Family sticks together, Clara. We protect each other. You need to remember where you came from. I laughed softly, a dry, humorless sound that seemed to catch her entirely off guard. You want to talk about where I came from? I asked her, tightening my grip on the phone. You want to talk about how family protects each other? That is a fascinating topic, Mother. Let us discuss family loyalty. Patricia sighed heavily into the receiver, shifting back into her professional victim routine. Clara, please. I know you have always felt a little left out, but you bring these things upon yourself. You push us away with your terrible attitude. Now I need you to listen to me carefully. I want you to pick up your phone, call whatever bank you illegally contacted, and reverse this mess immediately. Then I expect you to drive over to our house, look your father in the eyes, and beg for his absolute forgiveness. If you do that, And if you apologize to Brittany and Jamal for ruining their evening, we will generously sweep this entire embarrassing incident under the rug. We will forgive you, Clara. We will welcome you back with open arms. The sheer audacity of her demands was breathtaking. She genuinely believed she was offering me a gracious lifeline, fully expecting me to desperately grab it. She thought I still craved her toxic approval. I am not apologizing to anyone, I stated with absolute finality. And I am certainly not begging Richard for anything. You have absolutely no power over me anymore. You lost that privilege a long time ago. How dare you speak to me with such disrespect? Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the speaker. After everything we provided for you, we gave you a beautiful home, an elite education, a pristine life. You threw me out into the freezing rain. I interrupted sharply, my voice cutting through her hysterical rant like a serrated blade. Do you remember that night, Patricia? Because I remember every single agonizing second of it. I was 25 years old. I had a newborn baby wrapped in a thin blanket crying against my chest. The temperature was dropping below freezing, and the rain was turning into sleet. I stood on your immaculate front porch, banging my freezing fists against your heavy wooden doors, begging my own mother for a warm place to sleep just for one single night. Patricia went completely silent on the other end of the line. The memory was undeniable, an ugly truth she could not easily manipulate. I saw you. I continued, my voice steady, despite the raw surge of old pain coursing through my veins. I saw you standing in the front window. You looked right at me. You looked right at your infant grandson shivering in the cold rain. And then you slowly reached out and pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut. You turned your back on us and left us to freeze because we were a shameful stain on your perfect social image. You chose your wealthy neighborhood reputation over the life of your own daughter and grandson. So do not ever dare to lecture me about how family protects each other. You do not know the first thing about loyalty, and you certainly do not know anything about love. Patricia let out a furious scream, dropping every single ounce of her fake maternal facade completely. You are nothing, she shrieked. You will always be a massive disappointment to this family. I hung up the phone, feeling absolutely liberated, silencing her completely. War began. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen island, sipping a fresh espresso while watching the financial markets open on my tablet. My personal phone buzzed with a notification from Instagram. Despite everything that had transpired over the last 24 hours, my sister Brittany had not blocked me. She thrived on having an audience, even a hostile one. I tapped the notification, and her heavily filtered face filled the screen. She was sitting in the driver's seat of her least luxury SUV, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a manicured finger. The performance was meticulously crafted. She stared into the camera lens with a practiced expression of profound sorrow, letting out a deep, trembling sigh before speaking to her thousands of purchased followers. It has been a truly exhausting weekend, Brittany began, her voice quivering with fake emotion. Sometimes you have to make the incredibly painful decision to cut toxic family members completely out of your life. Protecting your peace is the most important thing you can do for your mental health. Some people just cannot handle seeing you succeed, and they will do absolutely anything to tear your happiness down. You have to walk away from that dark energy. I watched the screen with cold amusement. She was twisting the narrative, painting herself as the innocent victim of my supposed jealousy. She did not mention the frozen credit cards, the unpaid restaurant bill, or the fact that she was currently facing total financial ruin. She only cared about maintaining her flawless internet persona. But the absolute height of her delusion came in the very next story slide. The fake tears vanished, instantly replaced by a radiant, perfectly rehearsed smile. She tossed her hair over her shoulder and raised a branded coffee cup toward the camera. But we are choosing to focus entirely on the positive blessings in our life today, Brittany announced cheerfully. God always rewards good people. I am beyond thrilled to share that my father just secured a massive, historic corporate bailout for his commercial real estate empire. A highly exclusive Wall Street private equity firm has stepped in to fund our next major development phase. My brilliant husband Jamal worked tirelessly all weekend to finalize the legal contracts. To celebrate this massive victory, we are hosting an exclusive VIP yacht party on Lake Michigan next Saturday. It is going to be the absolute unmatched event of the entire summer season. She flashed a digital flyer on the screen, completely dripping with expensive gold foil graphics and pretentious fonts. I stared silently at the phone, genuinely astounded by the sheer magnitude of their collective denial. They were completely and utterly broke. Jamal had literally confessed to embezzling essential employee payroll funds to cover the massive deposit for that exact yacht rental. The holding company was officially in default, and all the commercial assets were securely locked pending liquidation. Yet instead of packing their bags and frantically calling a defense attorney, they were throwing a lavish party to celebrate a financial rescue that was never going to happen. They were dancing enthusiastically on the deck of a sinking ship, completely blinded by their own relentless greed and unchecked arrogance. I closed the application and turned off the phone. I had no time to entertain their pathetic digital circus. The weekend was officially over, and Monday morning required my complete focus. I kissed Leo goodbye, dropped him off at his prestigious private academy, and directed my driver to the financial district. The transition from my personal life to my corporate reality was always seamless. I walked into the soaring glass skyscraper in Manhattan, bypassing the crowded security checkpoints with my executive clearance. The elevator rocketed up to the top floor, opening directly into the silent, heavily guarded reception area of my private equity firm. My corner office was a fortress of polished mahogany, sleek modern glass, and absolute corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the entire city skyline. This was the empire I had built from absolutely nothing. I sat down at my massive desk and opened the encrypted financial terminal. The final liquidation schedules for Richard's real estate portfolio were loaded and waiting for my official executive authorization. I reviewed the abysmal numbers one last time. The debt-to-asset ratio was completely unsalvageable. I picked up my gold fountain pen and signed the physical execution orders, effectively finalizing the complete destruction of my father's business legacy. A soft knock on the heavy wooden door interrupted my focus. My executive assistant, Diane, walked into the office. She was a sharply dressed, highly efficient professional who managed my daily schedule with ruthless precision. She held a thick, oversized envelope in her right hand, an amused smile playing on her lips. "This arrived in the general corporate mail delivery this morning," Diane stated, walking across the plush carpet to hand me the envelope. It was addressed directly to the senior investment partners of the firm. "I screened it for security purposes, but I thought you would want to see the physical copy yourself given the specific sender." I took the thick envelope from her hands. The return address was printed in raised lettering. It was from the executive offices of Richard's commercial real estate company. I slid a sleek metal letter opener under the seal and pulled out the contents. It was a physical invitation to Brittany's yacht party. The cardstock was heavy, expensive, and coated in ridiculous gold trim. The cursive text formally invited the esteemed financial saviors of Wall Street to join the family in celebrating the dawn of a highly prosperous new corporate partnership on the waters of Lake Michigan. I stared down at the golden ticket resting on my mahogany desk. The sheer irony of the situation was almost poetic. They had spent thousands of stolen dollars to throw a victory party, and they had formally invited the anonymous corporate entity they believed was bailing them out. I looked up from the heavy golden invitation resting on my desk and met my assistant Diane's expectant gaze. A calculating smile spread across my face. They wanted the senior investment partners to attend their lavish victory celebration. It would be incredibly rude to decline such a formal request. "Diane," I said, keeping my voice sharp and professional, "clear my schedule for Saturday evening. Contact the executive board members and inform them that we have a mandatory corporate outing. Then, charter a private launch. We are going to a yacht party on Lake Michigan." Diane nodded quickly and exited quietly. Saturday evening arrived with a warm breeze sweeping across the dark waters of Lake Michigan. The rented luxury yacht was a floating monument to financial delusion. It was a massive tri-level vessel, illuminated by bright neon lights and blasting expensive club music across the harbor. The top deck was packed with Chicago's high society. Politicians, local celebrities, and wealthy socialites milled around sipping vintage champagne from crystal flutes. My family had pulled out all the stops, burning through the last remaining drops of their stolen employee payroll funds to create the total illusion of unstoppable corporate success. It was absurd. Brittany held court near the main bar, dripping in designer apparel. She wore a floor-length sequined gown that cost more than most people made in 6 months. Her wrists and neck were heavy with diamond jewelry, all purchased on maxed-out credit cards and empty promises. She was posing for photos with local influencers, making sure the hired photographers captured her best angles. She laughed dramatically, tossing her hair and bragging to anyone who would listen about her father's corporate triumph, completely ignoring the harsh reality of their situation. She thrived on the attention and the shallow glamour. Jamal was working this crowd on the opposite side of the deck. He held a glass of expensive scotch in one hand and used the other to gesture while he spoke. He had surrounded himself with several prominent commercial real estate investors and banking executives. He was taking credit for the imaginary financial rescue. "I negotiated the entire bailout structure myself," Jamal boasted loudly. "The private equity firm was tough, but I backed them into a legal corner. When you understand corporate law at my level, you easily dominate Wall Street." The guests nodded, impressed by his completely fabricated lies. Richard stood near the captain's wheel, acting like the undisputed king of Chicago. He was smoking a thick cigar, accepting handshakes and congratulations from his wealthy peers. He looked smug, completely convinced that his legacy was secure, and his fraudulent activities would remain buried forever. Patricia hovered at his side, wearing an obnoxiously large hat and a smug expression. They were all completely intoxicated by their own manufactured reality, deeply embedded in this absolute peak of their financial delusion. They genuinely believed they had won the war against their creditors and against me. Their arrogance was absolutely truly staggering. The pulsing music dipped slightly as a low, powerful hum echoed across the dark water. The guests near the railing turned their attention toward the harbor. A sleek midnight black private launch cut through the waves, heading directly toward the massive yacht. The launch was an aggressive, high-speed vessel, radiating pure corporate power. It slowed gracefully as it approached the yacht's lower boarding deck. The captain, recognizing the maritime approach codes of a VIP vessel, immediately lowered the boarding ramp and signaled his crew to assist the arriving guests. The entire party paused to watch the dramatic arrival slowly. Whispers spread across the crowded upper deck. Everyone assumed the mysterious Wall Street investors had finally arrived to claim their place of honor. Richard crushed his cigar in an ashtray and adjusted his expensive tie. Jamal abandoned his circle of captivated bankers and rushed toward the grand staircase, eager to greet the billionaires he claimed to have legally conquered. Brittany grabbed her mother's arm, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. They all scrambled to assemble a welcoming committee, desperate to grovel before the powerful executives who controlled their fate. They wanted to make a completely and absolutely flawless first impression. The heavy metal boarding doors slid open. 4 massive private security contractors stepped onto the yacht first. They wore identical tailored black suits and earpieces, scanning the crowd with cold professional efficiency. They immediately formed a protective perimeter around the entrance, establishing absolute dominance over the space. The whispering crowd fell into a hushed, nervous silence, intimidated by the sudden display of raw security. Then I stepped off the launch. I was dressed immaculately in a custom-tailored crimson pantsuit that screamed absolute authority. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless style. I wore no jewelry at all. Aside from a sleek, minimalist luxury watch, my attire was strictly business. I did not look like a party guest. I looked like an executioner. Flanking me on either side were the top executive board members of my private equity firm. They were older, ruthless financial titans who managed billions of dollars in global assets. They walked slightly behind me, perfectly projecting my status as the undisputed leader of our operation. The collective gasp that rippled through the crowd was audible over the quiet hum of the yacht engines. People who recognized me from high-level financial magazines stared silently. Their reaction was nothing compared to the absolute horror rapidly spreading across the faces of my biological family. Richard froze at the top of the grand staircase. The smug smile melted off his face, replaced by pure terror. Jamal stopped dead in his tracks, his glass of expensive scotch shattering loudly against the polished wooden deck. Brittany hid behind Patricia, who looked ready to collapse. I walked slowly up the stairs, my heels clicking sharply against the wood. My security parted the sea of wealthy guests. I reached the top deck, stopping 10 feet away from Richard, smiling very coldly. The stunned silence on the top deck stretched into an agonizing eternity as Richard stared at me. I watched the initial terror in his eyes slowly morph into a highly predictable display of arrogant delusion. His mind simply could not comprehend the reality standing right in front of him. Instead of accepting that his disowned daughter was leading a squad of corporate titans, his massive ego frantically constructed a pathetic alternative narrative to protect his fragile pride. He genuinely convinced himself that I had somehow managed to sneak past the harbor security, rented a high-end crimson pantsuit, and hijacked a private launch just to crash his victory party. He thought I was here to beg for a handout. The color rushed back into his weathered face, and he puffed out his chest, attempting to project the dominant paternal authority he had always used to crush my spirit. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, cleared his throat loudly, and took a deliberate step forward, signaling to the whispering crowd that he was still in complete control of the situation. Before Richard could even open his mouth to deliver his inevitable lecture, my younger brother Connor shoved his way through the crowd of stunned socialites. Connor was holding a half-empty glass of expensive champagne, his face flushed with alcohol and unearned arrogance. He wore a designer tuxedo that our parents had undoubtedly financed using their stolen corporate funds. He stepped directly in front of Richard, acting like a loyal guard dog protecting his master from a pathetic nuisance. Connor sneered at me, his eyes scanning my tailored suit with absolute disgust. He was entirely blind to the presence of the Wall Street billionaires standing quietly behind me. He only saw the sister he had spent his entire life mocking and degrading. He assumed the security contractors flanking me were simply yacht bouncers I had somehow bypassed on my way up the grand staircase. He puffed out his chest, desperate to play the hero in front of Chicago's elite, and decided to humiliate me publicly to secure his position as the favored golden child. "What kind of pathetic stunt is this?" Connor demanded, his voice ringing loudly across the quiet deck. "You really think you can just crash a private VIP event in a rented suit and pretend you belong here? We all know exactly why you showed up tonight. You saw the news about the massive corporate bailout Dad secured and you came crawling back to beg for a job. You probably cannot even afford to feed your kid. So you thought you could sneak aboard and scam some cash out of the family? You completely embarrassed last week." Connor took another aggressive step forward, attempting to physically block my path to Richard. He raised his hand, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face, entirely unaware of the absolute danger he was putting himself in by approaching me with such hostility. "You need to turn around and walk your pathetic self right back down those stairs," he ordered aggressively. "This yacht is strictly for successful corporate professionals and wealthy investors. We do not have any spare change to hand out to a desperate single mother." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply maintained my icy, unwavering gaze, completely unfazed by his pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. I did not even bother to speak to him. Connor was an absolute nobody, a parasite feeding off a dying host, and he was entirely beneath my notice. I offered a barely perceptible nod to the lead security contractor standing just inches from my right shoulder. The response was instantaneous and breathtakingly efficient. The massive contractor, a highly trained professional who had spent years handling hostile corporate threats, stepped smoothly in front of me. He did not yell, he did not throw a punch, and he did not make a dramatic scene. He simply raised his massive arm, placed a firm, immovable hand squarely against the center of Connor's designer tuxedo chest, and kept walking forward. The sheer physical power of the security contractor was absolute. Connor let out a sharp gasp as he was effortlessly swept aside like a piece of insignificant garbage. His expensive champagne sloshed out of his glass, spilling dark liquid all over his pristine white shirt. He stumbled backward, his highly polished dress shoes slipping awkwardly against the polished wooden deck. He flailed his arms wildly, trying desperately to maintain his balance in front of the watching crowd, but he ultimately crashed hard into a nearby cocktail table. The table wobbled violently, sending a tray of delicate crystal glasses shattering onto the deck. Connor landed in an undignified heap on the floor, his face burning with profound, inescapable humiliation. The wealthy guests gasped and stepped back, shrinking away from the embarrassing spectacle he had just created. I did not even break my stride. I stepped gracefully past my sputtering, humiliated brother without giving him a single downward glance. The remaining security contractors moved seamlessly with me, forming an impenetrable barrier that ensured no other delusional family member could dare approach me with physical hostility. I closed the final distance between myself and Richard, coming to a halt exactly 3 feet away from him. The smug, arrogant facade he had desperately tried to maintain just moments ago had completely evaporated. He looked down at Connor groveling on the wet deck, then looked up at the towering security contractors, and finally met my eyes. The absolute reality of the situation was finally beginning to penetrate his thick skull. I stood before him radiating pure, unadulterated corporate dominance, flanked by men who could ruin his life with a single signature. I smiled again, letting the silence stretch until the tension was entirely unbearable. "You really should teach your son how to behave around the people who own your debt," I stated coldly, my voice cutting through the humid air like a razor blade slicing through fragile glass. Richard opened and closed his mouth. The words failed to materialize in his throat as the heavy implication of my statement hung suspended in the humid night air. He looked past my shoulder at the elite financial executives standing in perfect formation behind me, recognizing the faces he had only seen on the covers of prestigious business magazines. He was standing on a rented luxury yacht paid for with embezzled funds, staring directly at the architect of his impending financial doom. Before Richard could formulate a single coherent excuse or attempt to salvage his shattered dignity, Brittany came storming across the polished wooden deck, her sequined gown sparkling aggressively under the bright neon party lights. She was absolutely furious. The entire yacht had stopped paying attention to her performance, entirely captivated by my dramatic arrival. She shoved her way through the whispering crowd of wealthy socialites, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated spite. As she marched toward our tense standoff, she snatched a full glass of red wine from a passing waiter's silver tray. She did not even break her stride, her heels stomping heavily against the wooden floorboards. She positioned herself right next to Richard, glaring at me with a toxic mixture of jealousy and blinding rage. Her entire focus was locked on me, the sister she had spent her entire life stepping on to elevate her own status. "What do you think you are doing?" Brittany demanded, her voice shrill and echoing loudly across the upper deck. "You are completely ruining my event. You have absolutely no right to be here. This is a private celebration for successful people, not a charity shelter for bitter dropouts." I maintained my icy composure, looking at her with total detachment. "I am exactly where I need to be, Brittany," I replied calmly. "You sent an invitation to my office. I simply decided to accept it." Her eyes darted frantically around the observing crowd, realizing that the attention of Chicago's elite was entirely focused on our confrontation. She needed to regain control of the narrative to reassert her dominance and humiliate me publicly, just as she had done at the steakhouse. She took a deliberate step forward, raising the glass of dark red wine in her right hand. She faked a dramatic, clumsy stumble, her ankle miraculously giving out on the perfectly flat deck. With a sharp, artificial gasp, she violently thrust her hand forward, intentionally hurling the entire contents of her crystal glass directly at my chest. The crimson liquid splashed heavily against my custom-tailored suit, soaking into the pristine silk fabric. The dark stain spread rapidly across my jacket and white blouse, a glaring stain. Several guests gasped. My lead security contractor stepped forward, his hand reaching out to intervene, but I raised a single finger to halt his movement. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I did not even look down at the ruined fabric clinging to my chest. I kept my gaze locked on her face, watching her lips curl into a vicious, triumphant smirk. "Oh my goodness," Brittany gasped loudly, employing her absolute worst, most transparent acting skills. "I am so incredibly sorry. The deck is just so slippery. I completely lost my balance. But honestly, Clara, you really should not have sneaked aboard a vessel moving on the open water. Accidents happen when you do not belong. She did not stop there. Emboldened by her perceived victory and desperate to destroy my credibility in front of the wealthy guests, she pivoted sharply to address the entire crowd. She raised her voice, ensuring that every single politician, banker, and socialite on the top deck could hear her toxic slander clearly. "Listen, everyone," Brittany announced, waving her arms to command the audience. "I am so sorry for this interruption. This woman is my estranged sister, Clara. She is a desperate single mother who lives in a tiny apartment and struggles to pay her bills. She saw the news about my father's corporate bailout and decided to sneak onto this yacht to trap a rich investor. She is just looking for a wealthy man to fund her lifestyle and take care of her kid because she cannot do it herself. Please ignore her. Security will be escorting her off the premises." The crowd began to whisper, their eyes darting between my stained suit and Brittany's posture. She truly believed she had won. She thought she had successfully painted me as a gold-digging opportunist, stripping away my authority and reducing me back to the helpless victim she needed me to be. She stood there, breathing heavily, a smug grin plastered across her face, waiting for me to run away in tears of shame. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my stained jacket and retrieved a crisp, monogrammed silk handkerchief. I calmly dabbed the dark wine droplets from my neck, maintaining absolute terrifying silence. The board members standing behind me watched the entire exchange with cold, calculating eyes. They were witnessing the sheer incompetence and emotional instability of the family whose corporate empire we were currently dismantling. Brittany had just demonstrated exactly why her family was entirely unfit to manage a single dime of institutional capital. "You are finished," Brittany hissed at me under her breath, her smile fixed firmly in place for the watching cameras. "Get off my boat before I have Jamal press charges for trespassing. You are nothing but an embarrassing stain on this family, just like that wine on your cheap rented suit." I lowered the silk handkerchief and smiled, a chilling expression that held absolutely no warmth. The trap was springing perfectly. She had played her part flawlessly, digging her own grave deeper than I ever could have managed on my own. I did not need to defend myself against her desperate, pathetic slander. The truth was about to hit her with the destructive force of a freight train, and she had absolutely nowhere to run. Jamal shoved his way past the bewildered guests, inserting himself directly between me and his deeply panicked wife. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, throwing his shoulders back to maximize his physical presence. The heavy gold watch on his wrist glinted sharply under the harsh neon lights. He glared at me with absolute contempt, entirely convinced that his legal pedigree made him invincible. "You have officially crossed the line," Clara, Jamal barked, his deep courtroom voice projecting across the silent deck. "This is a private corporate function celebrating a massive financial victory. You are not invited, you are not welcome, and you are currently trespassing on a privately chartered vessel. I am giving you exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk back down those stairs before things get incredibly ugly for you." I did not move a single muscle. My silence only infuriated him further. He whipped his head around, searching the perimeter, until he locked eyes with the yacht captain and the chief hospitality manager. "Security," Jamal bellowed, pointing a rigid finger at me. "I want this woman and her hired thugs escorted off this vessel immediately. I am the lead legal counsel for Richard Commercial Real Estate Holding Company. I brokered the massive private equity bailout we are celebrating tonight, and I carry the full authority to dictate who is allowed on these premises. Grab her and throw her off the deck right now. If she resists, call the harbor police and have her arrested for criminal trespassing and corporate harassment." The yacht staff froze in place. They looked at Jamal, then looked at the heavily armed private contractors surrounding me. My men wore earpieces and carried themselves with the lethal precision of former military operators. The yacht security team, composed of college students working summer jobs, wisely decided not to engage. "Do your jobs," Jamal screamed, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. "I am paying for this entire charter. I am the highest-ranking legal authority on this boat. Remove this desperate single mother before I sue this charter company into total bankruptcy." "You are not paying for anything, Jamal," I replied softly, my voice perfectly clear over the ambient noise. "You use stolen employee payroll funds to cover the deposit for this pathetic boat. You committed federal wire fraud to buy champagne for people who do not even like you. Jamal opened his mouth to scream another legal threat, but the words died in his throat. Suddenly, the deafening club music echoing from the massive speakers cut out completely. The sudden silence was absolute and terrifying. The only sound left on the top deck was the gentle lapping of the dark waves against the hull of the yacht and the nervous breathing of the wealthy socialites. Everyone turned their attention toward the grand staircase. The heavy wooden doors at the base of the stairs swung open with a loud, definitive thud. A tall, distinguished man in a flawless charcoal gray suit climbed the stairs with measured, deliberate steps. He carried a heavy combination locked leather briefcase in his right hand. This was David, the managing director of my private equity firm, and my most trusted subordinate. He had spent the last decade tearing apart failing corporations and liquidating assets with ruthless efficiency. His presence on this boat signaled the absolute end of Richard's fake empire. David reached the top deck and completely ignored the sea of panicked guests. He walked past politicians and local celebrities without offering a single glance. He bypassed Richard, who was currently sweating profusely through his expensive dress shirt. He walked directly toward me, breaking through the perimeter of my security contractors. He stopped exactly 2 feet away, offering a deep, respectful bow of his head. He did not look at Brittany, who was still clutching her empty wine glass, or Jamal, who was standing frozen with his arms still pointing aggressively in my direction. "Good evening, Madam Senior Partner," David announced clearly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent deck. "The final execution orders have been processed and certified by the Federal Bankruptcy Court. The asset liquidation protocols for the commercial real estate portfolio are fully prepared for your final executive review." The collective gasp from the crowd was deafening. The wealthy investors Jamal had been bragging to just minutes ago stepped back, their eyes wide with profound shock. Richard gripped the railing of the yacht, his knuckles turning completely white as his legs threatened to give out. Jamal lowered his trembling arm, the aggressive courtroom lawyer facade crumbling into absolute dust. He looked from David's expensive leather briefcase to my stained silk suit, his brain finally connecting the terrifying pieces of the puzzle he had desperately tried to ignore. Brittany staggered backward, leaning heavily against the polished wooden bar to stop herself from collapsing onto the deck. Her manufactured reality was currently burning down right in front of her perfectly contoured face. She looked frantically at Jamal, desperately waiting for him to produce a brilliant legal maneuver to save their stolen wealth and preserve their pathetic social standing. But Jamal had absolutely nothing left to offer her. He was completely outmatched, entirely outsmarted, and thoroughly outclassed by the single mother they had mercilessly mocked. I turned my attention back to David, acknowledging his flawless timing with a brief, respectful nod. "You brought the necessary physical documents?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly calm and steady. "Yes, Madam Senior Partner," David replied sharply, maintaining absolute professional decorum. He lifted the heavy leather briefcase and placed it firmly onto the nearest cocktail table. The loud metallic click of the brass locks popping open sounded exactly like a final, devastating death knell for my entire family. I stepped forward, leaving Brittany and Jamal trembling violently in my wake. This luxurious, completely unearned victory party was now officially over, and the absolute destruction of their fake empire had finally arrived. The real, inescapable reckoning was just beginning right here tonight. I stepped up to the cocktail table where David stood waiting. The heavy brass locks of his leather briefcase echoed across the deck. He reached inside with deliberate precision. The entire upper deck of the luxury yacht remained frozen. The politicians and local celebrities stared, holding their collective breath. They were witnessing a corporate execution playing out live on the water. David retrieved a thick stack of legal documents printed on the watermarked paper of my private equity firm. He placed them directly in front of me, smoothing the top page. He withdrew a heavy gold fountain pen and offered it to me. "Madam Senior Partner," David said, his voice projecting flawlessly over the dark waves. "The asset liquidation protocols for the commercial real estate portfolio belonging to your father are fully finalized. As the primary stakeholder and sole anonymous investor who acquired this outstanding debt, we require only your executive signature to commence the immediate seizure of all listed properties, corporate accounts, and secondary holdings. The words hung in the humid night air like an executioner blade. The absolute silence on the yacht shattered into frantic whispers, the wealthy guests backing away from my family. Richard let out a strangled sound that was half gasp and half sob. He stumbled forward, his polished dress shoes scraping awkwardly against the wooden deck. He reached a trembling hand out toward David, ignoring me in a desperate attempt to reassert his patriarchal dominance. There has to be a mistake. Richard wheezed, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. You are speaking to my daughter. She is a disgraced single mother. She was kicked out of our home 7 years ago. She has no capital, no corporate standing, and zero authority over my business. David turned his head slowly, looking at Richard with an expression of profound, chilling pity. He adjusted his suit jacket and replied with devastating calmness. You spoke to my junior acquisition team, sir. You never spoke to the senior partners because your portfolio was considered a highly toxic, severely mismanaged asset. The only reason our firm even entertained the acquisition of your massive defaulted loans was because Madam's senior partner specifically ordered it. She is not a disgraced single mother, sir. She is the majority shareholder of our entire operation. She is the mystery investor you threw this party to celebrate. Jamal shoved his way past Richard, his tailored suit, disheveled sweat pouring down his forehead. He pointed an aggressive finger at David, trying desperately to revive his arrogant courtroom persona, but his deep voice cracked with unadulterated panic. You cannot do this, Jamal shouted. This is a massive breach of corporate ethics. We have a verbal agreement for an extension on the primary loans. You are operating in bad faith. I will personally file an injunction first thing Monday morning. You are trespassing on a privately chartered vessel, and I demand you leave immediately before I have you arrested. I did not even look at Jamal. I took the gold fountain pen from David and let my fingers trace the engraved metal. You cannot file an injunction, Jamal, I stated coldly, my voice cutting cleanly through his pathetic legal bluster. Because as of 20 minutes ago, I officially froze the corporate accounts you plan to use to pay your retainer fees. You have zero capital to fight this liquidation. Furthermore, you cannot threaten anyone with trespassing when you rented this luxury vessel using embezzled employee payroll funds. When federal authorities review the transaction logs on Monday, you will be facing severe criminal charges for wire fraud. I suggest you save your aggressive courtroom performance for your upcoming trial. Brittany let out a loud, piercing scream. She clutched the sides of her sequined gown, her diamond necklaces sparkling mockingly under the neon lights. The reality of her impending poverty was finally crashing down on her fragile, image-obsessed mind. You set us up, Brittany shrieked, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure terror. You let us plan this whole party. You waited until we were surrounded by our friends just to humiliate us. You are a monster, Clara. You are destroying our entire lives over a petty family grudge. I finally looked up, meeting Brittany's furious, tear-filled eyes. I smiled, a genuine expression of absolute tranquility. You destroyed your own lives, Brittany, I replied smoothly. You lived completely beyond your means, you stole from innocent employees, and you built a fraudulent empire on a foundation of arrogant lies. I simply purchased the debt you willingly created. I lowered my gaze back to the documents. I uncapped the gold fountain pen, pressed the nib against the thick paper, and signed my name with a smooth, decisive flourish on the final execution order. I handed the pen back to David. The managing director carefully closed the legal portfolio, snapping the heavy brass locks shut with a resounding click that echoed across the terrified crowd. The transfer of power was officially complete. The commercial real estate empire Richard had built, the fake wealth Brittany had flaunted, and the arrogant legal shield Jamal had wielded were entirely gone. I turned to my security team and gave a subtle nod. The lead contractor immediately stepped forward, clearing a wide path toward the grand staircase leading down to my private launch. I stopped right in front of Richard, who was now leaning heavily against the yacht railing, gasping for breath as he clutched his chest. Patricia was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, completely shattered by the absolute loss of her social status. "Enjoy the rest of your party," I announced loudly, ensuring every wealthy guest heard my final declaration. We will formally conclude this business on Monday morning. I expect you to be present in my Manhattan boardroom at exactly 9 a.m. Do not be late. I turned my back on my ruined family and walked down the stairs, stepping onto my waiting launch as it sped away into the very dark night. The harsh morning sun reflected blindingly off the towering glass facade of the Manhattan skyscraper. It was exactly 8:45 on Monday morning, and the humid city heat was oppressive. Richard, Jamal, and Connor stood on the bustling sidewalk staring up at the imposing architectural monolith. They were sweating profusely, their expensive tailored suits clinging uncomfortably to their backs. Despite the absolute humiliation they suffered on the yacht, their toxic arrogance remained stubbornly intact. They spent the entire flight from Chicago convincing themselves the situation was entirely salvageable. In their deeply delusional minds, my dramatic exit on Saturday was just an emotional performance. They genuinely believed I would ultimately fold under their traditional patriarchal pressure. Richard aggressively adjusted his silk tie, attempting to project dominant corporate authority. "We just need to get her in a room," Richard declared, wiping sweat from his forehead. "She is still my daughter. She is acting out because she wants our attention and respect. Once I sit her down and offer her a nominal seat on our board, she will tear up those liquidation papers. She just wants to feel important." Jamal nodded enthusiastically, clutching a thick leather briefcase tightly against his side. He spent the weekend desperately drafting useless legal proposals and fake restructuring plans. "Exactly," Jamal agreed, his deep courtroom voice sounding strained. "We go in there, compliment her little firm, and offer a restructured payment plan. I will handle the legal negotiations. I know exactly how to corner these Wall Street types." Connor stood slightly behind them, checking his reflection in the tinted glass. He was nursing a bruised ego from being tossed aside. "Just offer to buy her kid a nice toy," Connor muttered dismissively. "She is just throwing a tantrum because her kid did not get a steak. Give her a little cash and let us get back to Chicago. My friends are waiting for me at the country club this afternoon." They walked through the massive revolving doors, entirely unprepared for true corporate power. The main lobby of my firm was a sprawling fortress of imported Italian marble. It did not look like a place where negotiations happened. It looked like a place where empires were dismantled. The sheer scale of the architecture was designed to make visitors feel incredibly small. Richard led the group toward the massive reception desk, flanked by intimidating security personnel. Behind the sleek marble counter sat three executive receptionists. They were impeccably dressed, radiating a chilling, untouchable professionalism. Richard slapped his hand down on the marble counter, commanding immediate attention. "Good morning," Richard announced loudly, using his booming executive voice. "I am Richard, the CEO of the Chicago Commercial Real Estate Holding Company. We have a scheduled 9 a.m. meeting with Clara. Tell her we arrived and expect coffee in the boardroom immediately." The lead receptionist, a sharp-eyed woman named Vanessa, did not blink. She slowly finished typing a sentence before looking up at Richard. Her expression was completely devoid of emotion. She did not smile, and she certainly did not seem impressed. "Name and identification," Vanessa requested in a flat, monotone voice. Richard bristled, deeply offended that he was not instantly recognized and deferred to. "I just told you who I am." Richard snapped, his face reddening. "I am her father. I own the real estate portfolio your firm is currently handling. Call her office right now and tell her Richard is here." Vanessa stared at him with absolute disdain. "Sir, we process billions of dollars in daily transactions," Vanessa replied smoothly. "I do not care about your biological relationship, and your commercial portfolio is currently listed in our system as a defaulted toxic asset. Provide your identification or security will escort you back to the sidewalk immediately." Jamal quickly stepped forward, nervously pulling out his driver license and shoving Richard aside. He handed over his identification, his hands trembling slightly. "We are the legal representatives for the defaulted portfolio," Jamal stated, his voice cracking. "We are here for the mandatory 9 a.m. summons." Vanessa snatched the identification, scanned it quickly, and handed it back without making eye contact. "Have a seat in the secondary waiting area," Vanessa ordered, pointing toward a row of stiff chairs. "You will be summoned when the senior partners are ready to process your liquidation." "We are not sitting in a secondary waiting area," Connor whined loudly. "We are VIP guests. We want the executive lounge." Vanessa finally looked directly at Connor, her gaze filled with profound corporate disgust. The executive lounge is for solvent clients with active capital, Vanessa stated ruthlessly. You are currently categorized as bankrupt debtors. Sit down and remain silent. The brutal reality of their situation finally began to crush their fragile egos. They were not powerful businessmen here. They were exactly what Vanessa said, bankrupt debtors. Richard, Jamal, and Connor slowly walked over to the stiff chairs and sat down in humiliating silence. The illusion of their massive Chicago wealth was completely stripped away in an instant. They were surrounded by actual billionaires, high-powered investment bankers, and ruthless financial analysts. Nobody looked at them. Nobody cared about their expensive suits or their fake social standing. As the minutes ticked by, the oppressive silence slowly broke their spirits. Jamal obsessively checked his heavy gold watch, his leg bouncing nervously against the floor. Richard stared blankly at the marble wall, the terrifying realization of his powerlessness finally sinking into his mind. Connor kept checking his phone, unable to comprehend why the receptionists were not serving them premium espresso. They waited for 45 agonizing minutes. I made them wait, letting the cold environment shatter their arrogant confidence. They needed to understand their manipulation tactics would never work here. At 9:45, the elevator doors chimed. David, my managing director, stepped out holding a clipboard. He walked over and looked down at my family. Follow me, David commanded sharply without offering a greeting. The senior partner is ready to terminate your company. David turned sharply on his heel, his highly polished leather shoes echoing against the pristine marble floor. Richard, Jamal, and Connor scrambled to follow him, their previous arrogance completely replaced by a heavy, suffocating anxiety. They walked through a labyrinth of frosted glass corridors, passing dozens of busy analysts and investment bankers who did not even bother to look up from their multiple glowing monitors. The atmosphere was thick with intense corporate energy, a stark contrast to the leisurely fake business environment my father operated back in Chicago. David finally stopped in front of a pair of massive double doors made of completely transparent soundproof glass. He pushed them open and stepped aside, gesturing for the three terrified men to enter the execution chamber. The boardroom was an architectural masterpiece designed specifically to intimidate. A massive polished mahogany table stretched across the center of the expansive room, surrounded by 20 ergonomic leather executive chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of the Manhattan skyline, placing the entire financial district directly beneath our feet. I sat alone at the absolute head of the table. I wore a tailored midnight blue suit, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on top of a thick-bound portfolio of financial documents. I did not stand to greet them. I did not smile. I simply watched them walk into my domain. Richard hesitated in the doorway, his eyes darting around the massive room, before finally settling on me. He swallowed hard, attempting to summon his usual commanding presence, but his shoulders remained visibly slumped. Jamal and Connor shuffled in behind him, looking like guilty schoolboys called into the principal office. David closed the heavy glass doors securely behind them, trapping them inside the soundproof room. He walked over and stood respectfully just behind my right shoulder, holding a pen and a legal pad, ready to document their complete destruction. Sit down, I commanded, my voice echoing clearly in the vast space. They moved awkwardly toward the chairs furthest away from me, clearly wanting to maintain as much physical distance as possible. Richard pulled out a chair and sat heavily, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. He forced a tight, artificial smile onto his face, desperately trying to pretend this was just a standard family meeting. Clara, Richard began forcing a hearty chuckle that sounded incredibly pathetic in the quiet room. This office is truly magnificent. I have to admit, your mother and I are incredibly proud of how far you have come. Now let us drop this formal business act and talk about how we can fix this tiny misunderstanding. I did not laugh. I did not blink. I picked up the thick, heavy stack of audited financial records resting in front of me and slid them forcefully down the center of the polished mahogany table. The thick binder glided smoothly and slammed right into Richard's hands. There is no misunderstanding, Richard, I stated coldly, completely stripping away his unearned paternal authority. And we are absolutely not discussing your feelings. Open the binder. We are going to review exactly why your commercial real estate empire is entirely worthless. Richard flinched at my tone but reluctantly opened the heavy binder. Jamal leaned over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the top page. Jamal's face immediately lost all remaining color. The document was a comprehensive forensic audit of their entire holding company, completed by my senior financial analysts over the weekend. It laid bare every single failure, every terrible decision, and every fraudulent transaction they had desperately tried to hide. Let us begin with page number 1. I instructed, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. You currently own 12 commercial properties in the greater Chicago area. You have repeatedly told your investors that your occupancy rate is 90%. That is a complete fabrication. Our auditors physically verified every single building. Your actual occupancy rate is barely 40%. You have been reporting signed leases from shell companies that you created yourself to artificially inflate your property values. Richard gasped, his hands trembling, as he stared at the undeniable proof of his deception. Clara, you do not understand the commercial market, Richard stammered weakly. We had to show projected growth to secure the renewal loans. It is standard industry practice to project future tenancy. It is called bank fraud, I corrected him ruthlessly. You used those fake occupancy numbers to secure a $50 million loan from a regional bank, which you immediately defaulted on. Flip to page 7. Let us discuss your cross-collateralization strategy. You leveraged the equity of your primary headquarters to purchase 3 abandoned retail centers, hoping to flip them for a quick profit. When those retail centers failed to attract buyers, you took out high-interest mezzanine loans to cover the operational costs. You built a pathetic house of cards, Richard. Every single property you own is leveraged against another failing property. If one mortgage defaults, the entire portfolio collapses, and last week 3 of them defaulted simultaneously. Jamal frantically flipped through the pages, his legal mind desperately searching for a loophole that simply did not exist. There has to be a grace period, Jamal argued, his voice cracking with panic. We filed for an extension citing market volatility. Your firm cannot legally seize these assets without allowing a standard restructuring phase. We have tenant rights. I shifted my gaze to Jamal, my expression entirely devoid of mercy. Turn to page 22. Jamal, I commanded softly. Read the fine print on the mezzanine debt that my firm purchased. The specific loans you recklessly signed waived all restructuring grace periods in the event of a multiple property default. You surrendered your tenant rights the moment you missed the 3rd consecutive payment. As the lead legal counsel, you should have actually read the contracts before securing the funds. Your spectacular legal incompetence is the exact reason your father-in-law is currently completely bankrupt today. Jamal sat frozen in his ergonomic leather chair. The heavy silence in the massive glass boardroom was completely deafening. He stared down at his shaking hands, the heavy gold luxury watch on his left wrist suddenly looking like a cheap novelty toy. The arrogant courtroom persona he had spent years carefully cultivating was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, naked terror of a man watching his entire life disintegrate in real time. I did not give him a single moment to recover. I shifted my gaze directly onto him, folding my hands neatly on top of the mahogany table. Now that we have established the absolute worthlessness of Richard's commercial real estate portfolio, I stated coldly, let us move on to the actual criminal portion of this morning agenda. David stepped forward and handed me a slender red manila folder. I opened it and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Jamal. He hesitated, his eyes darting frantically toward the door, before finally looking down at the document. This is a comprehensive ledger of your personal financial transfers over the last 14 months, I explained smoothly. You have been living a highly extravagant lifestyle, Jamal. Designer clothing, a leased luxury sports utility vehicle for my sister, expensive overseas vacations, and frequent dining at high-end steakhouses. Unfortunately, your actual legitimate salary as lead counsel does not even cover half of those expenses. Jamal swallowed hard, his apple bobbing nervously against his tight silk collar. Clara, this is protected personal information, he choked out, attempting one final desperate legal bluff. You have absolutely no right to access my private banking records. This is an unlawful breach of privacy. I am a licensed attorney. You are a thief, I corrected him sharply, my voice echoing off the floor to ceiling windows. And I did not breach your privacy. My forensic accountants simply traced the massive corporate capital bleeding out of Richard Holding Company. Turn to the second page of that document, Jamal. You did not just sign bad mezzanine loans. You actively established 6 separate shell corporations registered in Delaware. You systematically routed corporate funds through those dummy accounts and deposited them directly into your personal checking account. You committed federal wire fraud to buy my sister diamond necklaces. Richard let out a loud, strangled gasp, turning his horrified gaze toward his son-in-law. Jamal, what did you do? Richard demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and fury. You told me those transfers were standard operational tax shelters. You said you were legally protecting our liquid assets from the creditors. He lied to you, Richard, I stated ruthlessly, not taking my eyes off the sweating lawyer. Jamal has been bleeding your company dry to fund his fake internet lifestyle. But the wire fraud is not even the most repulsive part of this massive financial disaster. I gestured for David to hand me the final document. I slammed it down onto the table with a loud, resounding thud that made Connor jump in his seat. Let us talk about your luxurious victory celebration on Lake Michigan this past weekend. I continued, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. That rented yacht, the premium catering, the expensive champagne, and the string quartet. Jamal confessed to me over the phone that he used employee payroll funds to cover those massive expenses. But my auditors dug a little deeper into the ledgers over the weekend. You did not just steal from the operating capital, Jamal. You drained the employee pension fund. The absolute horror in the room reached a staggering new peak. Richard slumped back in his chair, clutching his chest as if he had just been physically shot. Connor stared at Jamal with his mouth hanging wide open. Stealing operational capital was one thing, but touching protected employee pension funds was a massive, unforgivable federal crime that guaranteed decades in a maximum security federal prison. You stole the retirement savings of the working-class people who built your father-in-law company, I declared, ensuring every single syllable carried the weight of a gavel striking a block. You ruined the lives of hundreds of innocent families, just so your wife could post pathetic, highly filtered photographs of a fake corporate bailout on her social media pages. Jamal began to hyperventilate. He clutched the edges of the mahogany table, his chest heaving as he desperately gasped for air. Clara, please, he begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You have to keep this inside the family. I will pay it all back. I will sell the cars. I will liquidate my personal stock portfolio. Just give me 30 days to replace the pension funds before the federal regulators notice the discrepancy. We can draft a quiet internal repayment contract right now. I leaned back in my executive chair, staring at the broken man sitting across from me. You are completely out of time, Jamal, I replied with absolute freezing finality. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not offer grace periods for embezzlement. I instructed my managing director to forward this entire forensic audit, along with the audio recording of your desperate confession, directly to the federal authorities at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. The SEC has already been fully notified. Federal agents are currently securing your Chicago offices, and they will be waiting to arrest you the second your plane lands. Your fake empire is entirely destroyed, and you are going to federal prison for a very long time. There is absolutely no escape from the devastating consequences of your relentless greed. The harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom seemed to shine down on him like prison spotlights. He buried his face in his hands, releasing a loud, pathetic sob that echoed against the thick glass walls. All of his expensive suits, luxury watches, and arrogant courtroom posturing could not save him from the absolute reality of federal prosecution that awaited him back in Chicago. The absolute reality of federal prosecution descended upon the boardroom like a suffocating blanket of ice. Jamal remained hunched over the mahogany table, his breathing ragged and shallow. The expensive custom-tailored suit he wore now looked entirely absurd, a pathetic costume draped over a terrified, broken man. He lifted his head, his eyes red and wild, frantically searching the room for any possible escape route. There were none. The glass walls of my empire offered absolutely no sanctuary. I was officially cornered and the instinct for self-preservation violently took over. Jamal whipped his head around and locked his furious gaze entirely on Richard. He pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at his father-in-law, his voice cracking with desperate, unhinged rage. "It was him," Jamal screamed, the sound echoing sharply against the soundproof glass. "It was all him. He forced me to do it. He told me that if I did not sign the fraudulent mezzanine loans, he would cut Brittany out of the will completely. He threatened my entire family." Richard recoiled violently, his face turning an unhealthy mottled shade of crimson. He gripped the arms of his leather chair, his knuckles turning completely white. "How dare you?" Richard bellowed, his booming executive voice shaking with absolute fury. "You incompetent, pathetic excuse for a lawyer. You came to me with the shell company strategy. You told me it was a brilliant tax loophole. You said you could hide the default status from the regional banks. I trusted your legal advice, and you completely ruined me." "I did not ruin you," Jamal shrieked, slamming his fist down onto the table. "Your bloated, pathetic ego ruined you. You refused to accept that your precious commercial empire was collapsing. You demanded that I keep siphoning the funds to maintain your fake billionaire status. You practically begged me to drain the employee pension accounts just to keep the country club memberships active. I have the emails, Richard. I kept every single email you ever sent me instructing me to forge those financial documents. I will hand them all directly to the SEC prosecutors. I am not taking the fall for your spectacular failures." Richard leaped out of his chair, ignoring the searing pain in his chest. He lunged toward Jamal, pointing a trembling finger right back at him. "You spineless coward," Richard roared. "You drained my company dry to fund your wife's disgusting vanity projects. You think the federal judges will not see the massive wire transfers to your personal checking accounts. You bought a $100,000 sports car with stolen pension money. You are going to rot in federal prison, and I will gladly testify against you." The absolute implosion of their fake loyalty was spectacular. They were turning on each other like starving wolves locked inside a tiny cage, desperately tearing at each other's throats to save their own skin. Every lie they had carefully constructed, every arrogant boast they had made at that steakhouse, was completely incinerated in the blinding light of federal scrutiny. They had built an entire family dynamic on the premise that they were infinitely superior to me, and now they were loudly confessing to massive corporate felonies just to avoid taking the blame. Connor sat frozen in his chair, completely forgotten in the chaotic crossfire. He stared back and forth between his father and his brother-in-law, his mouth hanging wide open in utter disbelief. The comfortable, wealthy lifestyle he had entirely depended upon was actively disintegrating before his eyes, and he possessed absolutely zero skills or ambition to survive in the real world. He was officially entirely cut off. Then the heavy glass doors of the boardroom burst open with a loud, aggressive clatter. The entire room went completely silent. Patricia and Brittany stood in the doorway, their faces pale and their eyes wide with profound panic. They had clearly been waiting in the secondary lobby downstairs, growing increasingly terrified when Richard and Jamal failed to emerge victorious. They had ignored Vanessa's strict instructions and bypassed security, desperate to find out what was happening. Brittany shoved her way into the room, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. She looked frantically from Richard's crimson face to Jamal's terrified expression. "What is going on?" Brittany demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "Why is everyone screaming? Did you get the bailout finalized? Jamal, tell me you got the extension signed." Jamal looked at his wife, his eyes filled with absolute pathetic defeat. He slowly shook his head, his hands trembling violently. "There is no bailout. Brittany," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Clara owns the debt. She froze all the accounts. She knows about the stolen pension funds. The SEC is already waiting for us in Chicago. We have absolutely nothing left." The devastating reality of his words slammed into Brittany like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her perfectly contoured face contorting into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at the massive stack of forensic audits sitting on the mahogany table, then looked back at Jamal. Her entire world, the luxury vehicles, the designer gowns, the superficial Instagram fame, was completely gone. She was facing absolute, inescapable poverty. "You stole the pension funds!" Brittany shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical, deafening pitch. You told me those transfers were standard corporate bonuses. You told me we were richer than ever. You completely lied to me. Jamal tried to reach out to her, his face twisting in desperation. Brittany, please, you have to understand. I did it for us. I did it for your lifestyle. Do not touch me, Brittany screamed. She lunged forward with explosive, blinding fury. She raised her right hand and slapped Jamal across the face with devastating force. The sharp, violent crack of her palm striking his cheek echoed loudly across the silent boardroom. Jamal stumbled backward, clutching his face in total shock. You completely ruined my life, Brittany sobbed, tears streaming down her face, entirely ruining her expensive makeup. You promised me wealth. You promised me status. Now I have absolutely nothing because you are a pathetic, incompetent criminal. I sat silently at the head of the table, watching the empire of lies burn completely to the ground. The family that had mocked my son over a basket of bread was now violently destroying each other in my boardroom. The absolute justice of the moment was entirely undeniable. Patricia had been standing frozen near the heavy glass doors, watching her perfect golden family violently tear themselves apart. The sharp sound of Brittany striking Jamal seemed to finally shatter her paralysis. She let out a loud, dramatic wail that echoed across the expansive boardroom. Patricia rushed forward, her expensive designer heels clicking frantically against the polished marble floor. She shoved her way past Connor, who was still staring blankly at the wall, and threw herself toward the head of the massive mahogany table where I sat in absolute tranquility, before David or my security contractors could intercept her sudden movement. Patricia dramatically collapsed onto the floor right beside my leather executive chair. She intentionally dropped to her knees, her expensive silk dress pooling awkwardly around her legs. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the edge of my tailored suit jacket. Her face was entirely soaked with tears, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. The haughty, arrogant matriarch who had mercilessly ridiculed me at the steakhouse was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate woman who finally realized she had absolutely no power left. Clara, please, Patricia begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. Please stop this. You have to stop this right now. You are tearing us apart. Your father is an old man with a heart condition. He cannot survive federal prison. Jamal is the father of your nieces and nephews. If the federal authorities arrest him, Brittany will lose everything. The children will be completely ruined. You cannot send federal agents to our offices. You must call the authorities and tell them you made a massive mistake. Tell them to drop the financial investigation. I am begging you on my hands and knees. I did not pull away from her grasp immediately. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I looked at her shaking hands, her desperate eyes, and her pathetic attempt to use Brittany children as a protective shield. She was playing the absolute ultimate victim card, deploying the heavy guilt trip that had always worked on everyone else in her social circle. She genuinely expected me to fold, to surrender my hard-earned corporate power out of some misguided sense of biological obligation. We are family, Clara. Patricia cried out, gripping my jacket even tighter. We are your blood. I carried you for 9 months. I gave you life. You cannot destroy your own flesh and blood over money. We can sit down and fix this together as a family. We will give you a seat on the executive board. We will respect you. Just please drop the legal charges and unfreeze the corporate accounts. I promise everything will be different from now on. We love you, Clara. We have always loved you. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her lies was breathtaking. I slowly reached down and firmly detached her trembling fingers from my expensive tailored suit. I did not shove her, but I made sure my physical rejection was entirely absolute. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes, my expression completely devoid of any sympathy, warmth, or forgiveness. She was a master manipulator, but her toxic spells had absolutely zero effect on me anymore. You do not love me, Patricia. I stated, my voice echoing coldly across the quiet boardroom. You love my capital. You love the massive financial rescue you thought I was going to provide. If I was still the broke, struggling single mother you kicked out onto the street 7 years ago, you would not be kneeling on this marble floor right now. You would still be sitting at that high-end Chicago restaurant, laughing with your favored children, while my son ate complimentary dinner rolls. Patricia gasped, her mouth opening and closing, as she desperately searched for a valid counter-argument that simply did not exist. I pushed my leather chair back and stood up, towering over her kneeling form. The entire room was completely silent. Richard was leaning against the table, gasping for breath. Brittany was sobbing quietly against the glass wall. Jamal was staring at the floor, completely defeated. They were all listening to my final judgment. You demand family loyalty only when it benefits your bank account. I continued, my voice sharp and unwavering. You demand forgiveness only when you are facing federal prison sentences. But loyalty is earned. Patricia, and you burned that bridge the night you threw me and your infant grandson out into the freezing rain. You spent my entire life treating me like a pathetic burden, a shameful stain on your pristine country club reputation. You actively conspired to steal my peace, and now you want me to save you from the natural consequences of your own massive fraudulent greed. I took a deliberate step forward, forcing Patricia to lean back to maintain eye contact. My gaze was absolute zero. You did not order a steak for my son because we were not worth it, I declared, repeating the exact agonizing sentiment they had weaponized against me just a few days prior. I let the heavy, devastating reality of that statement crush whatever remaining hope she harbored in her chest. Today, Patricia, you are not worth my capital. I turned away from her and looked directly at David, my managing director. David stood perfectly straight, his face an unreadable mask of corporate efficiency. I offered him a single definitive nod. David immediately raised his hand and signaled the private security contractors waiting near the heavy glass doors. Escort these bankrupt debtors out of my building, I commanded loudly. If they resist, or if they ever attempt to step foot on my corporate property again, call the authorities and have them arrested for criminal trespassing. The contractors moved with terrifying precision, hauling Richard and Jamal away. Another grabbed Brittany. The last escorted Patricia out, sealing the heavy doors forever. The glass doors sealed shut with a loud thud that echoed through the boardroom. I stood alone at the head of the table, listening to the muffled sounds of my family being escorted onto the street. The air in the room felt entirely different now. It was clean and completely free of their toxic presence. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored midnight blue suit and walked back to my corner office. David followed silently, holding the executed liquidation orders. We spent that week dismantling Richard's fake empire piece by piece. My analysts worked relentlessly, auditing every fraudulent ledger, transferring viable properties, and legally isolating the massive debts Jamal had accumulated. I felt no remorse or hesitation. They had built a towering house of cards on a foundation of lies and embezzlement, and I simply removed the bottom card. By Friday afternoon, federal authorities secured the Chicago offices, seizing all computer hard drives and financial records for their ongoing criminal investigation into the stolen pension funds. The trap had sprung with absolute flawless precision. Exactly 1 week after our explosive confrontation in Manhattan, the inevitable public reckoning arrived. Monday morning brought a devastating wave of journalism that annihilated my family's crafted social image. A major financial newspaper published a massive front-page expose detailing the collapse of Richard's holding company. The headline was absolutely brutal, highlighting the massive default and the ongoing federal investigation into severe wire fraud. Chicago business publications picked up the story, plastering Richard's face across their digital platforms. The articles thoroughly exposed his fake occupancy rates and his desperate illegal attempts to secure fraudulent mezzanine loans. The financial community reacted with swift, merciless judgment. Regional banks that previously extended him credit froze all his remaining personal accounts to prevent capital flight. Jamal faced an even more spectacular professional destruction. His prestigious law firm, terrified of being implicated in his embezzlement schemes, publicly terminated his employment before noon. The managing partners issued a scathing press release denouncing his actions and confirming they were cooperating with federal authorities. Jamal was stripped of his lucrative salary, expensive corporate perks, and entire professional reputation in hours. He was officially a disgraced, unemployed lawyer facing imminent federal indictment. While Richard and Jamal were destroyed in the press, Brittany experienced her own unique brand of absolute humiliation on social media. Desperate to maintain her illusion of extreme wealth and silence, the growing rumors among her purchased followers, she decided to host a live broadcast on Instagram. I watched the stream from my office tablet, sipping my morning espresso with cold amusement. Brittany stood in the wide driveway of her leased suburban mansion, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a branded coffee cup. She forced a bright, completely artificial smile for the camera, attempting to spin a pathetic narrative about taking a temporary break from high society to focus on mental wellness. She confidently told her thousands of viewers that the news articles were entirely fabricated by jealous competitors trying to tear down her successful family. Her performance was incredibly convincing until a loud, aggressive diesel engine interrupted her broadcast. A massive heavy-duty tow truck backed aggressively into her pristine driveway right in the middle of her live stream. Brittany froze, her fake smile melting into an expression of sheer panic as two burly repossession agents jumped out of the truck cab. They completely ignored her frantic protests, walking straight toward her matching set of leased luxury vehicles. Brittany dropped her professional influencer persona instantly, screaming at the men to get away from her expensive cars. She completely forgot she was still broadcasting live to over 10,000 viewers. The lead repo agent simply handed her a legally binding seizure notice, loudly stating that the leasing company had revoked her vehicles due to 3 months of severe non-payment. The viewers watched in absolute, high-definition shock as the repo men swiftly hooked chains to her pristine white luxury sports utility vehicle and dragged it onto the flatbed tow truck. The comment section of her live stream exploded with merciless mocking and brutal reality checks. Her fake, carefully curated digital empire was entirely shattered on camera for the entire world to witness. She frantically ended the broadcast, but the screen recordings had already gone viral across multiple social media platforms, cementing her absolute social destruction. The sudden catastrophic loss of their stolen wealth hit my younger brother Connor the hardest. With Richard's personal accounts completely frozen and the suburban mansion actively being seized by angry creditors, Connor was aggressively evicted from his comfortable basement sanctuary. Having spent his entire adult life being financially coddled and protected from real-world responsibilities, he was entirely unprepared for absolute poverty. Without his parents' stolen money to fund his expensive habits, Connor was rapidly forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of actual survival. He managed to rent a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment on the rough outskirts of Chicago, completely devoid of the luxury he felt he inherently deserved. Desperate to pay his basic utilities, the former golden child was forced to accept a grueling minimum wage position stocking shelves at a massive retail hardware store. He spent his days wearing a bright orange uniform vest, hauling heavy boxes of industrial supplies under harsh fluorescent lights. Unable to cope with his sudden lack of privilege, Connor took to social media to complain bitterly about his terrible circumstances. He posted lengthy whining rants about the unfairness of manual labor and the terrible cruelty of his family, cutting him off without warning. Instead of finding sympathy, his pathetic complaints were met with overwhelming ridicule. Former high school classmates and local acquaintances relentlessly mocked his spectacular downfall, pointing out his years of unearned arrogance. He had officially become the ultimate scapegoat for his own monumental incompetence. I turned off my tablet, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. The toxic family that had tried to destroy me was now completely buried under the devastating consequences of their own unrelenting greed. The swift and brutal collapse of Connor was merely a side note compared to the spectacular legal annihilation that rapidly consumed Jamal. The federal investigation into the stolen pension funds progressed with terrifying speed. Federal prosecutors do not waste time when clear evidence of wire fraud is handed directly to them, wrapped in an undeniable bow. Within days of the initial raid on the Chicago offices, the State Bar Association formally announced a fast-tracked disciplinary hearing regarding Jamal. They did not even wait for the criminal trial to conclude. The sheer magnitude of his financial crimes combined with his blatant violation of fiduciary duties resulted in his immediate and permanent disbarment. His prestigious license to practice law was stripped away, turning his expensive law degree into a completely worthless piece of paper. I went from being a high-powered corporate attorney to an unemployed, disgraced felon facing decades behind bars. The rapid speed of his downfall shocked the local legal community, erasing his carefully curated reputation overnight without a trace. The moment the disbarment became official public knowledge, Brittany immediately turned her vicious survival instincts directly onto her husband. Desperate to salvage whatever tiny shred of her fabricated social standing remained, she aggressively filed for a highly public, exceptionally messy divorce. She hired a cutthroat divorce attorney, using the very last of her available credit, determined to paint herself as the innocent victim of Jamal and his deceitful financial manipulation. The divorce proceedings quickly devolved into a pathetic, highly publicized media circus. Brittany leaked embarrassing audio recordings of Jamal begging her for forgiveness, while Jamal retaliated by legally exposing her massive secret shopping debts and the staggering cost of her cosmetic procedures. They spent weeks tearing each other apart in the local tabloids, airing every toxic, ugly detail of their superficial marriage for the entire world to mock. They viciously destroyed whatever remaining dignity they possessed, proving that their union was built entirely on greed rather than actual affection. Their toxic relationship burned completely to the ground, leaving nothing but bitter resentment and overwhelming debt behind. While Brittany and Jamal were busy destroying each other in divorce court, Richard faced a much darker, inescapable reality. A federal grand jury officially handed down a massive 47-page indictment against my father. The charges were absolutely staggering. Multiple counts of commercial bank fraud, severe employee pension embezzlement, corporate tax evasion, and interstate wire fraud. The federal prosecutors held a highly publicized press conference in downtown Chicago, holding up Richard as a prime example of egregious corporate greed and horrific executive misconduct. They announced they were seeking the absolute maximum sentence allowed under federal sentencing guidelines. Richard was formally arrested at his leased temporary apartment, led out in standard-issue steel handcuffs, while local news cameras captured every single humiliating second of his terrifying downfall. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch who had cruelly demanded that I pack a lunch for my hungry son was now facing the very real prospect of spending the rest of his natural life eating bland cafeteria food in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Patricia, entirely stripped of her precious country club status and her endless supply of stolen money, was forced to quietly move into a small, nondescript apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. She had absolutely no friends left to call, no social events to attend, and no power to wield over anyone. The women she had spent decades trying to impress had entirely blacklisted her, treating her name like a highly infectious disease. She was entirely alone, trapped in a bleak, quiet existence, left only with the bitter memories of the massive empire she had helped destroy through her own boundless vanity and cruel enablement. Her desperate attempts to contact former allies were met with dial tones and slammed doors. The luxurious reality she felt so entitled to had dissolved into dust, leaving her to face the harsh consequences of her toxic maternal failures without any financial cushion to soften the devastating blow. She was a ghost haunting her own ruined life. She finally understood true isolation. I observed this entire sequence of catastrophic events from the absolute safety and comfort of my Manhattan office. I read the detailed legal briefs forwarded by my managing director. I watched the humiliating news broadcasts detailing Richard and his criminal indictment. I occasionally scrolled past the vicious, embarrassing tabloid articles covering the spectacularly toxic divorce between Brittany and Jamal. Many people might assume that watching your own biological family systematically destroy themselves and face federal prison would evoke some measure of profound grief or lingering guilt. They might expect me to feel a brief pang of sorrow for the people who shared my DNA. But as I sat in my plush leather executive chair looking out over the magnificent skyline of the financial district, I felt absolutely nothing of the sort. I felt no guilt. I felt no sadness. I felt no lingering obligation to reach out and offer them a lifeline. They had crafted their own demise. The concept of family loyalty is a two-way street, and they had burned their side of the bridge to ashes a long time ago. They made their calculated, malicious choices every single time they prioritized their fake social image over basic human decency. They chose to be cruel, they chose to steal, and they chose to treat me and my young son like worthless garbage. I simply provided the heavy mirror that forced them to finally look at their own horrific reflections. The consequences they were currently suffering were entirely manufactured by their own relentless, unforgiving greed. The heavy toxic chains that had bound me to their dark, manipulative world were now officially, legally, and permanently severed. I was completely free from their crushing expectations and their exhausting conditional love. I had successfully excised the poison from my life with absolute surgical precision, ensuring they could never again threaten my peace, my career, or my beautiful son. I closed my laptop and stood up from my leather executive chair. The digital clock on my desk read 3:00 on a crisp Friday afternoon. The financial markets were closing soon, and my portfolio was performing flawlessly. I had spent the entire week dismantling the toxic remnants of my past, and now it was finally time to focus entirely on my future. I walked out of my corner office, giving a brief nod to my executive assistant, Diane. I told her I was leaving early for the weekend and to forward any urgent matters to David. She smiled warmly, knowing exactly how heavy the past few weeks had been. I stepped into the private elevator and rode it down to the bustling Manhattan street below. My driver was waiting in my sleek black town car. I gave him the address for Leo's elite private academy on the Upper East Side. The drive through the city felt incredibly peaceful. The usual chaotic noise of New York traffic seemed entirely muted. I watched the pedestrians rushing down the sidewalks, completely unaware of the massive corporate war I had just decisively won. I felt a profound sense of lightness in my chest. The crushing weight of my family's expectations was permanently gone. We pulled up to the prestigious private school just as the afternoon dismissal bell rang. The heavy oak doors opened, and a stream of students wearing crisp navy blue uniforms flooded out onto the pristine stone courtyard. I stepped out of the car and waited by the wrought iron gate. Within moments, I spotted Leo. He was walking with two of his classmates, laughing brightly at a shared joke. His backpack looked massive against his small frame, but he carried it with easy confidence. When he saw me waiting by the gate, his face lit up with pure joy. He waved goodbye to his friends and ran directly into my arms. I knelt down and hugged him tightly, breathing in the scent of his cedar shampoo and fresh air. He wrapped his small arms around my neck, squeezing me with absolute unconditional love. This was the only family I ever truly needed. This beautiful, perfect boy who loved me for exactly who I was, not for what kind of wealth or status I could provide. "How was school today?" I asked, smoothing his dark hair away from his forehead. "It was amazing," Leo answered enthusiastically. "We learned about the solar system in science class, and I got a perfect score on my spelling test." I smiled, feeling a surge of intense maternal pride. "That is wonderful news, Leo. I am so incredibly proud of you." I stood up and took his hand, leading him toward the waiting town car. "Since you had such a spectacular week at school, I decided we should do something very special tonight to celebrate. We are going out for a fancy dinner, just the two of us." Leo climbed into the spacious back seat, his eyes wide with excitement. "Where are we going?" he asked, buckling his seatbelt. I slid in beside him and instructed the driver to head toward the Manhattan flagship location of the exact same high-end Wagyu steakhouse where this entire saga had begun. The restaurant was located in the heart of the financial district, projecting the same aura of extreme exclusivity and wealth as its Chicago counterpart. We walked through the heavy glass doors and were immediately greeted by the sophisticated ambiance of the dining room. The air was rich with the scent of roasted garlic, expensive wine, and perfectly seared premium beef. The general manager of this location had been thoroughly briefed by Thomas regarding my elite VIP status. He rushed over the moment we stepped into the lobby, offering a deep, respectful bow. "Good evening, Madam's senior partner," the manager welcomed us warmly. "It is an absolute honor to serve you and your son tonight. We have prepared our best private alcove for your dining pleasure." He led us through the bustling restaurant, completely bypassing the crowded main floor. We were seated at a beautiful, intimate table, enclosed by thick velvet curtains, offering us total privacy and absolute comfort. The waiter appeared instantly, pouring sparkling water and handing us the leather-bound menus. I did not even bother opening mine. I looked directly at the waiter and delivered my order with total confidence. "We will be having your absolute finest dry-aged tomahawk wagyu steak," I instructed smoothly. "I want it perfectly seared medium rare. Please add a generous portion of truffle macaroni and cheese, the grilled asparagus, and your signature chocolate lava cake for dessert. Oh, and please make sure the steak is brought directly to my son. He has a very large appetite tonight." The waiter bowed respectfully and hurried off to the kitchen. Leo looked at me with massive, sparkling eyes. "A whole tomahawk steak just for me?" he asked, his voice filled with pure wonder. I reached across the table and held his small hand. "Yes, sweetheart. You deserve the absolute best of everything in this world, and I promise you will never have to settle for anything less ever again." We spent the next hour talking and laughing together in complete peace. There were no arrogant corporate lawyers bragging about fake wealth. There were no manipulative grandmothers making passive-aggressive comments. There were no cruel sisters intentionally leaving my son out to prove a pathetic point. The toxic noise of my former family had been entirely replaced by the genuine quiet joy of a mother and her son. When the food arrived, it was a spectacular culinary display. The waiter carried a massive wooden board holding the enormous smoking tomahawk steak. He set it down gently right in front of Leo. The meat was sizzling loudly, the rich aroma filling our private alcove. Leo gasped in delight, his eyes wide as saucers, as he picked up his fork and knife. I watched him take his first bite of the incredibly tender, perfectly cooked beef. A massive smile spread across his face, and he let out a happy little hum of appreciation. He ate his luxurious meal with total joy, completely surrounded by genuine love and absolute security. I sat back in my plush leather chair, sipping a glass of vintage red wine, and watched my son enjoy his feast. The lingering shadows of my past were completely eradicated by the bright, beautiful reality of our present. I had successfully protected my child, dismantled a fraudulent empire, and secured our future with ruthless surgical precision. The painful chapters of my history were permanently closed, locked away behind federal indictments and shattered social facades. I raised my wine glass in a silent, solitary toast to the incredible peace I had aggressively fought for and rightfully earned. I was finally completely free, and the view from the top of the world was absolutely magnificent.